All right, we're live on Facebook. Facebook, welcome. Glad you are here with us. This is Mike Davis, and I am one of the teachers and leaders at the Oasis in Southern California. So glad you can join us for the teaching portion here. We're going to pray that we're going to get into our study for this morning. So Father, we thank you in Jesus' name, as always, for your spirit. We ask that you would show us your ways, teach us your paths, lead and guide us into your truth and teach us, because you are the God of our salvation. And we look to you, we trust in you all the day. We thank you, Father, for giving us your spirit of truth and leading us and guiding us by your spirit into your truth. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, everybody, if you have your Bibles, turn to Genesis chapter 3. And we have been on this series on Who's the Boss? Women and Men in Biblical and Cultural Context. And I kind of did, I wouldn't say a sub-series. Let me get a sip of water here. Excuse me. But one of the things that we started covering as we were looking at men and women in the scriptures and seeing what is the Bible in the Hebrew scriptures, what does it have to say about the relationship between men and women and how men and women are to relate to each other. And so I started talking about, because of everything that we've covered this far, that we need to start to rethink, reconsider the complementarian foundation for women's subordination to men. Okay. And I've been sharing that over the past 3 weeks. Today, I'm going to give, I believe it will be the final conclusion. I will be giving my final thoughts about that. And then we're going to be talking about something else next week. Still in our series of Who's the Boss? Women and Men in Biblical and Cultural Context. But we're going to finish up today with my final thoughts and conclusion about rethinking the complementarian foundation for women's subordination. This is message number 4, where this is concerned. We have done 37 messages thus far in our series. Genesis chapter 3, verse 16 is a verse we've read before. I just wanted to revisit it. Verse 16, this is after the fall. God comes to the man and the woman, and he says to the woman in verse 16, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. In pain, you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Now, I'm not going to go into depth about this passage. We covered this in detail in one of the earlier sessions, so you can go back and read it. But I wanted to start here and looking at the fact that God said to the woman, he shall, the man, your husband, shall rule over you. Now, egalitarians see this as the start, as the beginning of the subordination of women to the rule of men. They see it as the result of the sin of the man and the woman in the garden. Complementarians see it differently. Complementarians see this passage, for the most part, most complementarians see this passage here not as the consequence of the fall, but as a reaffirmation of what God created and designed at the very beginning of creation. So from a complementarian point of view, this is not the result of the fall. Most don't see it like this. They see it as, this is really a reaffirmation. There are some who might see it as a consequence. Most do not. Again, we've covered this before. They see it as a reaffirmation that the leadership, the rule of men over women did not start in Genesis chapter 3, as the egalitarians say, but it started in Genesis 1 and in Genesis 2. So complementarians, they see as God's original design, they see a relationship model where men are created and designed to lead women, and women are created and designed to submit to and follow the lead of their husbands or the lead of men in a supportive manner. So men are supposed to lead, husbands are supposed to lead, or I'll say men/husbands, because depending on which complementarian you talk to, it could be wider or narrower, but men/husbands are supposed to lead, and women are supposed to submit to and follow that lead in a supporting manner. And I could add to that, and women are never supposed to lead men. They're never supposed to lead men. This is the relationship model. In this model, men are always in the superordinate position. Here's a new word for you, a superordinate position, while women are always in the subordinate position. The word superordinate means a person who has authority or control of another within an organization. Superordinate can mean superior in rank, superior in class, superior in status. So when I say that men are always in the superordinate position, they're always in the one in authority. They are always the ones in control. They always have that higher status than the women. As a matter of fact, Dr. John Ortland, has an article in the book, Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, called Male-Female Equality and Male Headship. And it's here in this book, which I've often referenced. This could be considered the Bible of the complementarian movement. And I don't mean that in a pejorative way. I mean that simply that this is considered the book to go to if you want to really understand the complementarian view. Okay, just as I don't have it right here. Oh, wait a minute, I have it right here behind me. This book here, Discovering Biblical Equality, is seen as the, quote, Bible. And again, I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I mean in a positive sense, actually. So it means, sees it as the Bible, meaning if you want to really get a good idea of the egalitarian view, here's a book that has a lot of information. The book that's the opposite of that is this one, Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. This is the complementarian, where you find a lot of complementarian views. So Dr. John Ortland has an article in here called Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. Excuse me, he has an article called Male-Female Equality and Male Headship. And he is representative of the complementarian model and view. Let me read to you what he has to say about men and women and their relationship in this complementarian model. So on page 124 of the book, what he says, let me find it here. Yeah, here it goes. He says, it's page 124, in the partnership of two spiritual equal beings, he means man and woman, in the partnership of two spiritually equal beings, man and woman, the man bears the primary responsibility to lead the partnership in a God-glorifying manner. Now, when they talk about in the complementarian world, the equality of men and women, that equality is usually and almost always defined as your spiritual equality, your worth and value before God. That's what they mean by equality. They do not mean functional equality. And if you read the material, they make it clear. Men and women are equal in terms of their worth and their value before God. They're both the image of God, so they have equal worth and value. So they define the image of God as equal worth and value. But when it comes to function, or what they call roles, those are not equal. And man is always seen as being in what I call, or what could be called, the superordinate position. He is always higher. He is always the one in the lead. As Dr. John Ortland says here, in the partnership of two spiritually equal, notice that spiritually equal human beings, man and woman, the man bears the primary responsibility to lead the partnership in a God-glorifying direction. On page 132, he basically states this again. On page 132, he says, does a wife possess under God all the rights that her husband has in an unqualified sense? As the head, the husband bears the primary responsibility to lead their partnership in a God-glorifying direction. So from the point of view of those who are involved in the complementarian view, they have a complementarian model of the relationship between men and women. It is the men who are seen as the primary leaders. Now, Dr. John Piper, who is actually one of the editors of this book with Dr. Wayne Grudem, John Piper, in his article called A Vision of Biblical Complementarity, Manhood and Womanhood Defined According to the Bible, he has in this book defined what he calls the heart of both biblical manhood and womanhood, the heart of it, the core of it, all right? So let me read to you what he says and what he gives as the definition of biblical manhood, what he calls the heart of it, what you could say the core, I would say the essence. This is the essence of biblical manhood, according to Dr. John Piper. He says, quote, this is page 41 of the book, at the heart of mature masculinity, or manhood, is a sense of benevolent responsibility to lead, provide for, and protect women in ways appropriate to a man's differing relationships. So he says that the heart of a man's masculinity is a sense of benevolent responsibility to lead, to provide for, and protect women. On page 52 of the same book, this is what he says again about men and the leadership. He says that the heart, this is page 52, at the heart of mature masculinity is a sense of benevolent responsibility to lead, provide for, and protect women. And he explains why he has the word women and not wives. He says, quote, I do not say wives because there is a sense in which masculinity inclines a man to feel a responsibility for leadership and provision and protection toward women in general, not just toward wives or relatives. Masculinity and femininity are rooted in who we are by nature. They are not simply reflexes of a marriage relationship. Let me read some more. Man does not become a man by getting married, but it is clear that the form that leadership, provision, and protections take will vary with the kind of relationship a man has with a woman, from the most intimate relationships of marriage to the most casual relationships with a stranger on the street. Now, what Dr. Piper is saying here is that all men are to lead when it comes to other women. Now, that leadership may take on various forms, but every man in relationship to some woman, the man is always supposed to be in the lead. The man is supposed to, and he calls it benevolently, but he has the responsibility to lead, not only with women, not only with his wife, not only with maybe, let's say, like I have 3 daughters, not only with, my daughters, according to Dr. Piper, I have a general responsibility to lead any woman that I come in contact with. I'm supposed to be in the position of leadership at all times, okay? Now, this is what he says about women. This is how he defines women. This is on page 54 of the book in his article, A Vision of Biblical Complementarity, Man and Woman, Manhood and Womanhood Defined According to the Bible. He says in terms of women, this is the heart, the meaning of femininity. At the heart of mature femininity is a freeing disposition to affirm, receive, and nurture strength and leadership from worthy men in ways appropriate to a woman's differing relationships. Now, notice this again. At the heart of mature femininity is a freeing disposition to do what? This is the heart. This is what it means to be a woman. To affirm, receive, and nurture strength and leadership from worthy men in ways appropriate to a woman's differing relationship. So when it comes to a man, the core of our masculinity is that we lead. When it comes to a woman, the core of her femininity is that she submits to, nurtures, encourages the leadership of a man. And so in terms of these definitions, what I found remarkable, because I went back over this past week as I was preparing this message, and I thought, let me reread again the views of complementarians about leadership. And as I read Dr. Piper's his statements here, I just found it remarkable again that for both that in terms of both manhood and womanhood, as defined by Dr. Piper, it has at its core the leadership of men. That everything revolves around the leadership of men. The man leading the woman is the core of it, okay? So both the femininity of a woman and the masculinity of a man has to do with leadership by the man. That is the core, both for the femininity of a woman and for the masculinity of a man. It all revolves around the leadership of the man. It puts the man really at the center. It puts the man and his leadership at the center. Now, of course, he says, if you read the whole thing, he talks about you're to use that leadership to love and to support and to nurture women. Women are to nurture and receive and affirm and strengthen the leadership of a man. But honestly, at the heart of it, it's the leadership of men. It puts men at the center of both masculinity and femininity. I don't think I'm misreading that to say that, okay? So here's one other thing I wanted to read that I skipped over. Let me read to you something that he said about, he quotes another scholar. I was actually surprised to hear this, scholar by the name of J.I. Packer, who's for many people, he's a well-known scholar, a beloved scholar. And he quotes J.I. Packer, who I came to find out was a complementarian. I was surprised to find that out. But this is what J.I. Packer this is what Piper says. He says, we must reckon with the possibility that in various spheres of life, it is possible that role relationships emerge for men and women that so deeply compromise what a man or woman senses is appropriate for their masculine or feminine personhood that they have to seek a different position. In other words, as men and women are working together, because he's talking about men and women working together, and if men and women are working together and you have a woman who's in the leadership of a man, how does that work when, according to Piper, the biblical order is, and according to all complementarians, the biblical order is men are supposed to be in the position of leadership. This is why I use the term superordinate. Men are always in the superordinate leadership, authority, in control of position. Women are always to be in the subordinate. But what do you do when in life you meet a situation like I did one time when I was working for Mattel? When I was working for Mattel, my boss was female. When I was working for another company, Midram Precision Products in Rancho Cucamonga, California, shout out to Midram, I just love working there. The CEO of the company at one point, while I was working there, was a female. So what do you do when the situation is that a man is not in charge, it's a woman, when, according to Piper and other complementarians, the biblical model, according to them, is that men are supposed to lead. The heart of masculinity is that we benevolently take the responsibility to lead, provide, and protect. And women, the heart of their femininity is to receive and to affirm and to nurture the leadership of men. Well, when it's reversed, what do you do? So Piper asked this question, and then he quotes from J.I. Packer. He says, this is what J.I. Packer implies when he makes the following perceptive observation. Because what Piper is saying is that you may get to a point where you feel like, you know what, it's no longer appropriate for me and my personhood, my masculinity, to serve or to work for a woman where a woman is telling me what to do. Piper here says, let me read it again before I read J.I. Packer. He says, we must reckon with the possibility that in the various spheres of life, it is possible that role relationships emerge for men and women that so deeply compromise what a man or woman senses is appropriate for their masculine or feminine personhood that they have to seek a different position. So what he's saying here is that I could get to a point where I go like, this is just compromising, having to be submitted to and follow a female is too much compromising my masculinity, my male personhood. So what is it that I'm supposed to do? He's saying that you may feel like you have to seek a different position. He quotes J.I. Packer in support of this. Packer says, quote, while I am not keen on hierarchy and patriarchy as terms describing the man-woman relationship in scriptures, Genesis chapter 2, verse 18 through 23, which speaks of the creation of woman, and Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21 through 33, which talks about the man-female relationship, it calls women to submit to men, and it calls the man to, it says he is the head, even as Christ is the head of the church, and so on and so on. We're going to be covering that when we get to the New Testament portion. So let me start over again. While I am not keen on hierarchy and patriarchy as terms describing the man-woman relationship in scripture, Genesis 2, 18 through 23, and Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21 through 33, continue to convince me that the man-woman relationship is intrinsically non-reversible. Now, this means that you really can't have women leading men and men being in submission to and following women. He says, by this, I mean that other things being equal, a situation in which a female boss has a male secretary, or a marriage in which the woman, as we say, wears the trousers, she is taking the lead, this will put more strain on the humanity of both parties than if it were the other way around. So in other words, let me finish. This is part of the reality of the creation, a given fact that nothing will change. This is part of the reality of the creation, a given fact that nothing will change. So what Piper is saying here is that there comes a point where if a man is serving if a man has a female as a boss, a female is the boss of a man, that will eventually put a strain on them. It will put a strain on their humanity than the other way around. So in other words, if a man is leading a woman, no problem. There will be no strain. But if a woman is leading a man, that will put a strain on both of them. And he said, this is just a fact of creation. So the idea here again is from a complementarian point of view, men were created to lead. It's like it's in our DNA. It's who we are. It's what we're supposed to do. To be a man is to be a leader. To be a woman is to follow the leadership of the man. This is the complementarian point of view. I do not believe, I've read this over and over, did my best to make sure I'm quoting correctly. I'm not exaggerating this, but this is what is taught, okay? So once again, we see that when it comes to this model, this complementarian model, where men and women are concerned, their manhood and their womanhood revolves around leadership, not leadership of the man and the woman, but the leadership of the man. That becomes the heart in the center of the relationship model that complementarians put forth where men and women are concerned. So a man is a man if he leads. If you're not leading, you're not being a man. A woman is to be supportive of her husband or of other men, because what Piper and John Piper and J.I. Packer and Dr. Wayne Grudem, the idea here is not just simply you submit to your husband, but that men are supposed to lead even other women that may not be relatives, either other women that may not be their wives. You are to lead in some way, form, or fashion in ways that are appropriate. And if you are not doing that, and if other women are leading, according to the complementarian view, according to Piper, according to Dr. Packer, according to Dr. Wayne Grudem, well, these Piper and Dr. J.I. Packer, it'll put a strain on your humanity because you're not functioning the way God created you to be. Now, again, I find this remarkable. With all due respect, I find this remarkable. I put a footnote in my book when I first read that. I went, where do you get this from? Where do you get this from? I don't think there's any science to back this up. And biblically, as we have seen and we'll look at again, there's no biblical basis to back this up. What he's doing is taking like Genesis chapter 2 that he quotes in Ephesians 5. Now, I don't think Genesis 2 teaches the subordination of women to men. Ephesians 5 does talk about women submitting to men and men being the head. We're going to talk about that, so stay with me. But there's no way that these passages say, and if you are not in these positions, the positions are reversed, because he calls them non-reversible, it will put a strain on your personhood. That's reading into the text. That's reading something that's not there at all, and that the text or any text ever says, with all due respect to Dr. Packer. Okay, so this is the view. So male rule, male leadership, and female submission to that rule or leadership of men, this is seen as the norm. This is seen as, this is how God set it up. Now, there are some who advocate that, again, Genesis 3:16 reaffirms the model that was established at creation in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Again, egalitarians don't believe that. I would hold myself to be an egalitarian or a mutualist, and I do not believe that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 teaches that men are supposed to be in charge, men are supposed to lead, that was established at creation, that is basically a part of our DNA or part of our created being. I don't think the biblical text teaches that. But again, within the complementarian view, there are those who see it this way. So they see that this is the norm. They also teach that any deviation from the norm is seen as going against and usurping God's, quote, good design. I see that coming up at times. This is God's good design. Men are to lead, women are to be submitted to that lead, follow that lead, support that lead. Men are supposed to give the lead in a way that's beneficial and loving towards women, but nevertheless, men are always supposed to lead. And if you do not follow that lead, it is seen as a sin. So at the heart of the masculinity, again, of men and women is male leadership. As I was reading through this book again, I was reading through Piper's passage on this. He even extends this to sexual relationships, physical intimacy between husbands and wives. His point is that while women may invite her husband to be with her, it is really an invitation for the man to take the lead. So he brings this down to, and I'm trying to be very respectful here of Dr. Piper, but this is why I found it so remarkable that this stretches to everything. It stretches to society. It stretches to every woman that I meet, and vice versa with the women are concerned. That where he was saying that where wives are concerned, you don't really take the lead when it comes to being physically intimate with your husband. You invite him, but you're inviting him to take the lead. And I'm looking at this and I'm going, wow. This is really embedded in their psyche that at all times, men are to lead. It was even, if you read this book, there's a section in here where he talks about, and I've mentioned this before, where let's say all the women who may be watching this, let's say I come to you and I say, hey, I'm trying to get to the nearest mall. Can you tell me where the nearest mall is? According to Dr. Piper, because I'm asking you for direction, you have knowledge that I don't have, right? You are, in a sense, in a position of leadership over me. But you should communicate those instructions to me in such a way is that it respects my masculinity. In other words, it respects my position as a man. So you've got to make sure you communicate with me in such a way that I am still maintained and respected and held in the position of leadership, even though you as a woman are giving me the instructions. Matter of fact, let me read you what he actually says. So you know I'm not making this up, okay? Let me find where it's at. And again, like I said, when I read this, I was like, I read it again, I was like, wow, I didn't have to look at this. I have to find it here in the book here. Let me find it, give me a moment here. Where is it at? Where is it at? Where is it at? Oh, went too far. Because he has a whole section here of how this should work out. And it's, wait a minute, I'm in the wrong place. Yeah, I'm in the wrong place. Okay, that's why I couldn't find it. I was in the wrong place. Okay. Okay, so he says here, he talks about how, let's see. I'm just trying to look at where to start here. Okay, so he says, he talks about the fact that women may find themselves in roles that put some men in a subordinate position to them, okay? He says, and he lists several different type of roles: prime minister and her counselors and advisors, college teachers and her students. So even he sees college teachers, you know, you're a college teacher, but you have male students, you know, that puts you in a role where they are subordinate to you. He says one or more of these roles might stretch appropriate expressions of femininity beyond the breaking point. But in any case, regardless of the relationship in which a woman finds herself, mature femininity will seek to express itself in appropriate ways. There are ways for a woman to interact, even with a male subordinate, that signals to him and others her endorsement of his mature manhood in relationship to her as a woman. I do not have in mind anything like sexual suggestiveness or innuendo. Rather, I have in mind culturally appropriate expressions of respect for his kind of strength and glad acceptance of his gentlemanly courtesies. Her demeanor, the tone and style and disposition and discourse of her ranking position can signal clearly her affirmation of the unique role that men should play in relationship to women owing to their sense of responsibility to protect and lead. So again, it's saying that women need to always be aware of, even when they are in positions of authority over men because of the way society today is set up, they always need to be aware of how they are communicating so as to signal to the man that she respects his leadership as a man. He goes on to say, it is obvious at this point that we are on the brink of contradiction. Yeah. Suggesting that a woman may hold a position of leadership and fulfill it in a way that signals to men her endorsement of their sense of responsibility to lead. But the complexities of life require of us this risk. To illustrate, and this is the illustration I was alluding to earlier, to illustrate, it is simply impossible that from time to time, a woman will not be put in a position of influencing or guiding men. For example, a housewife in her backyard may be asked by a man how to get to the freeway. At that point, she is giving a kind of leadership. She has superior knowledge that the man needs, and he submits himself to her guidance. But we all know that there is a way for that housewife to direct the man in which neither of them feels their mature femininity or masculinity is comparable. Let me read what he was actually saying. But we all know that there is a way for the housewife to direct the man in which neither of them feels their mature femininity or masculinity compromise. So even women, if somebody comes and asks you for direction, if it's a male, you need to make sure that you express those directions in such a way that you do not violate your femininity, that you do not in any way, form, or fashion imply that by giving directions, you are in charge and he is not. You want to make sure that he walks away with his sense of masculinity, his sense of leadership as a man, that it is still intact. This is why I say I found it remarkable that even at this level, they're saying Men are to always be in a position of leadership, and women are to always submit, even if they're submit to that leadership and nurture and support and affirm their leadership, even if it's simple as asking for directions to the freeway. Okay, so I find that remarkable that this is taken to this level. And Dr. Piper is one of the leading voices when it comes to the complementary model. This is not somebody who is unknown, who has a blog of about 2 people and he's just writing stuff. This is somebody who's well known, and these are the views that he puts forward. Okay, so I'm not making this up. Now, again, there are those who see that any deviation from this norm is going against God's good design. Some even see it as sin. They will directly say it is a sin. If you're not leading and you're letting the wife lead, it's a sin. Some even say, as we talked about in one session, Dr. Can't remember, I can see his face right now. Dr. John MacArthur believes that it is a sign of the judgment of God when women are in the lead and men are not. So this is how serious it gets. Again, all this revolves around who's the boss, which is why I called this series, Who's the Boss? Who's the boss? Who's the boss is going to determine whether or not we're following God. Who's the boss is going to determine whether or not we are in alignment with God's good design and plan for relationships between men and women. But as I've been saying, and I'm going to ask it again, do we see this in the scripture? Is this the model that I just shared with you from the complementarian view? Is this the model that we see in scripture? And again, the answer is no. We see women, godly women, deviating from this supposed norm. This is not the norm. In our study together over the past 30 lessons or so, we have looked at the leadership of Miriam, Deborah, the wise woman of Abel Beth Ma'akah, the wise Abigail, who was the wife of Nabal. We looked at the Shunammite woman, the prophetess Huldah, the Proverbs 31 woman. We've seen that all these women were not according to the norm. We also see in the scriptures women acting in a proactive and in courageous ways apart from the leadership of men in the book of Exodus. Matter of fact, we see this at the start of the narrative of Moses and the deliverance of the people of Israel. Go to Exodus chapter 1. And for those of you who follow me on Facebook, you may have seen I posted about this past week. Now I just want us to look at it in this study. So make sure we got it recorded, okay? So in Exodus chapter 1, starting at verse 15, this is the story that begins the narrative of the deliverance of the people of Israel and also the birth of Moses, who God is going to use to deliver his people Israel. So the Egyptians and Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, is concerned about the growth of the children of Israel, that they're growing and spreading in a humongous way. That they're getting larger and larger, so he gets concerned. So in verse 15, it says, then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shiphrah and the name of the other Puah. And he said, when you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women and see them on their birth stools, if it is a son, then you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and saved the male children alive? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them. Therefore, God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mighty. And so it was because the midwives feared God that God provided households for them. So Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born, you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. Now we're going to chapter 2 and the birth of Moses. And a man of the house of Levi went and took as wife a daughter of Levi or Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's banks. And his sister stood afar off to know what would be done to him. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to the bath at the river, and her maidens walked alongside the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Then his sister said, Moses' sister, then his sister, this is Miriam, said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. So the maiden went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, to Miriam, or to Moses' mother, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed him, and the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she called his name Moses, saying, because I drew him out of the water. Fascinating story. Here's some things that I was thinking about and meditating on this week about this story. When we look at the story again, we see that these women are acting in very decisive, courageous, and very decisive, proactive, and courageous ways. In the complementarian view, as we said before, it is men who are the leaders, the protectors, and the providers. This is what John Piper says, that this is the man's primary role and responsibility, that this is what men do as in terms of their masculinity. Their primary role is to lead, to protect, and provide. Yet in the story of Moses that we just read here, in the beginning of his story, it is women, Shiphrah and Puah, who are shown as, number one, resisting Pharaoh's decree and protecting all of the male sons of the Hebrews. The men are nowhere mentioned. We do not see men coming to the protection of these children. Now, I'm not putting down men when I say this. I'm just stating it as a fact. We do not see men acting to protect the children. It is the women, Shiphrah and Puah, who are protecting the male sons. Number two, it is Moses' mother who protects him. And she also is the one who conceives and executes the plan to preserve his life. She is the one, the scripture tells us, who builds the ark. She's the one who gathers the material. His father is not mentioned in this narrative at all. We don't see his father mentioned. Was he doing anything? Don't know. He's not mentioned. But his mother is seen as the one who is providing the protection. Number three, it is Miriam, not Moses' father or Aaron, his brother, who watches over him as he floats down as he floats in the river. So it's a female again who's watching over Moses. It's not his father, not his brother. It's not a male. What was that? Three? Three. Number four, it's the daughter of Pharaoh, another female who rescues Moses and preserves his life and looks to make provision for him. And she does this knowing he is a Hebrew child. She does this knowing what her father has decreed, and she directly acts in contradiction, in disobedience to her father's decree. It is not a man doing this, it is a woman. Number five, it is Miriam who makes sure that he's provided for. It's Miriam who comes and says, hey, do you want me to go get a midwife for you to nurse the baby? And so it is Miriam who does this. Again, it's not Moses' father, not Moses' brother. It is Moses' sister. It is a female who goes and seeks out the provision on the behalf to make sure that Moses is taken care of. She's the one who approaches the Pharaoh's daughter. All of the major characters in this preservation of Israel's future deliverer, the future lawgiver, their greatest leader, all of the people, all of the major players here in the beginning of the story, these are all women, not men. And again, in the complementarian view, we should expect it to be men. It is men who are the leaders, according to Dr. John Piper. It is men who are the providers. It is men who are the protectors. But in this story, it's all women and no men other than Pharaoh. He ain't seen in a good light here, okay? All of the men there is no mention of them. It is all women who are being the protectors. It is women who are shown taking the lead, being the providers and being the protectors. Let me read to you. I was reminded that Dr. Carmen, Carmen, if you're watching this, I'm sorry. I believe it's Carmen Eames. Her last name is pronounced I-M-E-S. If I got that wrong, please forgive me. I will get it right for the next time, I promise. But she also did write about this in this book called The Biblical World of Gender, The Daily Lives of Ancient Women and Men. And she has a chapter in here where she talks about these women, which I'm not sure if I had read it. If I had read it, I had forgotten about it. But it's chapter 5, Freedom Fighters of the Exodus. And she talks about all of the women that I just talked about. She goes on to say, though, I'm going to read to you from page 44 of the book. She says, women do not usually take center stage on the pages of scripture, But in this liberation story, the sentences are crowded with feminine pronouns and feminine verbs. The narrative presents a dramatic face-off between the man in power, Pharaoh, and the women who defeat him. It anticipates God's own work of redemption. Any articulation of what women can and cannot do must reckon with the freedom fighters of Exodus. Miriam was likely only 6 years old when she joined the fight against injustice. The risk of losing her brother weighed more than the potential risk to herself. She and her mother did what they had to do. Shiphrah, one of the two midwives named in Exodus, refused to obey the king's edict because she knew that a higher power was watching her. She feared God rather than man and got busy doing his work. Pharaoh's own daughter used her privilege to save just one life. She could have said, what difference would it make to save one baby? What difference would it make to save one baby boy when hundreds are in danger? But she did what she could, and that one boy grew up to deliver the rest of the Hebrew nation. These women take their place in the long line of faithful people whose contributions God has honored. No matter what our convictions, no matter what our context or convictions about what is allowed, what is possible, every woman then and now has a sphere of influence that she can leverage. Each of the Exodus women maximized her culturally defined role to flip the tables on injustice. So can we. I think that's beautifully said by Dr. Imes, or Eames, depending on how you want to pronounce her name. But Carmen said this beautifully, okay? By the way, hope to have Carmen to interview here on here one day where we can talk about these issues some more. Now, again, when we look at this, what, as Carmen said, is really true. These women were protecting one boy who grew up to be the deliverer of the nation. So without these women taking the lead, and again, we see no evidence of them first conferring with men about their plans and their actions. We don't see this. Without these women taking the lead, Israel would have had no Moses. Now, you could argue, well, you know what? God's in control. This was God's sovereign plan. There was going to be a Moses. But I would say this. If you wish to argue that God in his sovereignty raised up Moses and that Moses would have been protected anyway, then we also have to argue if we are consistent in our hermeneutic interpretation and principles, which is one of the things I said, we got to be consistent. We want to argue that God is sovereign, then we also have to argue that God in his sovereignty also raised up each of these women to take the initiative and lead apart from any guidance or leadership from men. Because again, as far as we can tell from the text, they received no help, no consultation, nor did they look for any consultation from any men. And again, this is contrary to the complementarian model that says it is the primary responsibility of men to lead and for women to support, to encourage, and to follow that lead. We don't see that here with these women. In all of the examples that we have covered thus far, these women here in the book of Exodus, the women that I mentioned earlier, Miriam, Deborah, Abigail, the Shunammite women, the wise woman of Abel Beth Ma'akah, and so on. All of these women, when we look at them, all of these examples, in all of these examples, we see women acting with agency. They are acting with authority. They're acting with decisiveness. They're acting with autonomy without first having to check with men because, quote, the men are the primary leaders. We don't see them following this model. We see godly women in Israel deviating from the supposed norm that since men are the lead and men are the one who bear the primary responsibility to lead, protect, and provide, therefore women need to submit to, follow, and encourage that lead. We don't see these women doing this. We see godly women in Israel deviating from the supposed norm and acting as leaders. They're acting with leadership even in regards to men. That is, they are even leading other men as we look at all of these different stories. Now, not in every instance is that true. Like with the women here, we don't see them leading any men, but in the other stories, Deborah, Miriam is seen as a leader of Israel. That would mean she is leading men. This means that there is a reverse, contrary to what J.I. Packer said. And the idea, let me say it right here, the idea that, well, Miriam only led women, there is no basis for that in the biblical text. What we read in Micah chapter 6, verse 4, is that God said, I sent before you. He said, I brought you up out of the land of Egypt, and I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. We are not told that Miriam only led the women. We are told that Moses, Aaron, and Miriam led Israel. okay? And we did a whole section on that, and including debunking the argument that that doesn't mean that they didn't, that because God said he sent them before them, it doesn't mean that they led. They led. The plain reading of the text is that they led Israel. That would mean that Miriam was leading women. The Shunammite woman, we saw her as a woman of leadership, of decisiveness. Abigail, we see her taking action contrary to her husband's decision and leading the male servants. We see these women acting as leaders throughout the biblical text. So they're not following the norm, they're deviating from the norm. They're deviating from the complementarian model. How is this deviation explained by complementarians? They explain it in at least two ways, which we've already covered, but I'll recap it here real quick. Number one, they will say, well, what we see as a deviation is not really a deviation. The women are not really leading. They are just being good wives or good women and supporting the men. They're supporting the husbands, but they are not really leading. They're actually upholding the men. They are actually upholding the men are always to be the leader model. So this is how, one of the ways that complementarians explain it. The women are not, Deborah wasn't really leading. Hola's not really leading. They're actually being supportive of the men according to our model. And men are really the primary leaders, not the women. The second way that they explain it is that, well, these women are exception to the rule because God couldn't find any good men to step up and lead. So God had to choose these women. But there are those who say, but again, they're not really leading. They are just motivating and encouraging the men to step up. And again, this is holding to the complementarian model of men are always to be in the lead of women. So these women, well, yeah, it was an exception to the rule. And as some will say, it's an exception that proves the rule. I said, no, it's an exception. It was not even an exception. These women are leading, okay? And so it's not just, well, because God couldn't find any good men. We also, in one of our sessions, talked about that, and for lack of a better term, debunked that also, okay? So these are two basic ways that this is talked about. In summary, the leadership of women over men in Scripture tends to be, from those who come from a complementarian model, when they see the leadership of women in Scripture, the leadership of women, either it gets downplayed, it gets diluted, or it gets outright denied. In summary, that's basically what happens. It gets downplayed, diluted. Well, they're leading, but not really leading, or it gets downplayed, or, well, you know, it's not really leadership. They were just really there because there were no men stepping up, or just outright denied. Nope, they're not leaders at all. They were not leaders at all. Now, why is this done? Because it contradicts the complementarian model. The complementarian model of men always being the primary leaders and women being the followers who are supposed to uphold the leadership of men, and that they are never to lead men. That's the complementarian model. So you have to explain it in this way in order to uphold the model. Because if you start to say, yeah, these women are leading and these women are being decisive and they're not checking with the men and they're going contrary to even sometimes the decision of the men, this blows the model out of the water. It tears down the model. The model can't be sustained, okay? So this is why complementarians, this is how they talk about and how they view what I call the deviation from the norm. Now, here's the thing. While I disagree with the complementarian model, we do have to acknowledge that in the ancient Near Eastern culture, and this is the culture in which Israel lived, this is the culture in which the Bible was written, it was a culture that was male-dominated or male-centric, okay? It was a male-dominated, male-centric culture. This is the cultural context. This is the background of the Hebrew scriptures and of the people of Israel. I have not found one scholar who disagrees with this. Every scholar, whether they're complementarian or egalitarian, they all agree this is a male-centric, male-oriented, male-dominated culture. This culture has been labeled a patriarchal culture, a patriarchal culture. In the ancient Near East, ancient Near Eastern culture and ancient Israelite culture was not, so let me say this again, ancient Near Eastern culture, ancient Israelite culture was not an egalitarian culture. But again, when we look at the scripture, we see godly women acting as leaders, acting as providers, acting as protectors within this male-centric, male-dominated culture. And again, this is contrary to the, well, the man is supposed to lead at all times, complementarian model. So how do we explain this contradiction? On the one hand, it is a male-dominated culture, not practically, I think every scholar agrees with that. And by the way, I'm using my word specifically, male-dominated, male-centric culture. Yet we see women acting as leaders, even of men, in this male-dominated culture. And the women that we see leading, providing, and protecting, they are portrayed always in a positive light. They are not labeled or condemned as sinful because of taking a leadership position. And we do not see men in these stories protesting against the leadership of women or arguing for, well, look, the man is always supposed to lead. They're not arguing for that model. They're not arguing for a complementarian model. When you see the woman at Abel Beth Ma'achah in 2 Kings, when we see the woman, when Joab comes and he's going to destroy the city, and she comes to the wall and she speaks to him, and she speaks the Proverbs, she speaks wisely, she speaks strategically, and she says, what do you want? He says, we want Sheba. She says, I'll be right back. We're going to throw his head. She goes, and they immediately do it. The men follow her counsel. We don't read, she checked with the men, she counseled with the men. She is called a wise woman. They listen to her. This was a woman of leadership. I do not see personally how you can say this woman was not a woman of leadership. And the men of the city, by the way, here's the thing, even if you don't want to say, I don't think that she was a leader, why is it that it is the woman who came to the wall, not the men? He said, well, the men were scared. We're not told that in the text. The men were cowards. We're not told that in the text. We're just told that this woman is a wise woman, which puts her in a positive light. She's leading, she's protecting her city. And we don't see any man in her story. We don't see any man in the story of Deborah. We don't see in any of the other stories that we've mentioned, the Shunammite woman, the Proverbs 31 woman. We don't see the men rising up going, hey, y'all need to stop doing all this stuff. You need to, I'm supposed to provide. I'm supposed to lead. I'm supposed to protect. That's the man's job and responsibility. We don't see this being argued, and we don't see God rebuking any woman for being in this position. I'm going to say something. I'm not trying to be mean when I say this. The only criticism or rebukes we see come from outside, come from a complementarian view. That's the only way, and they don't really rebuke the women. They just simply say, well, these women are not really leading. That's the only critique we see. It's coming from the outside for those who read it in a complementarian manner. There were some rabbis, by the way, who did negatively critique Deborah and Huldah. Not all of them, but some of them did. Again, why? Because it went contrary to this male-dominated view of women being in charge. But we don't see this in the biblical text. We don't see it. We don't see the men protesting against the leadership, the provision, the protection of the women. So is there a way to explain the leadership of women that we see within this ancient male-centric, male-dominated culture without downplaying, diluting, or denying the leadership of the women? Is there a way to explaining what we see as the leadership of these women? Can we explain it without downplaying, diluting, or denying their leadership? And I believe that there is. I'm going to be pulling from now the work, a work that I've been reading from throughout this series, and that's the work of Dr. Carol Myers in the book, Rediscovering Eve. She offers an explanation for this that I believe is on track. I believe it's on point. Dr. Carol Myers explains that what we see in ancient Near Eastern culture, what we see in ancient Israelite culture is not a patriarchal culture, but a heterarchal culture. I'll say that again. This may be new. This is news. First time I introduced it. And I've been waiting for weeks to get to this point. What Dr. Myers says is what we see in the ancient Near Eastern culture that will help to explain why we see women in positions of leadership and men not protesting it is because we're not looking at a patriarchal culture. We're looking at a heterarchal culture. Hetero, H-T-E-R. A-R-C-H-A-L, for those of you who want to write that down and maybe look it up somewhere later. Let me read to you what Dr. Myers has to say on this from the book, Rediscovering Eve, Ancient Israelite Women in Context, okay? In case you're wondering who she is, she holds the, at least when this book was written, the Mary Grace Wilson Professorship in Religion at Duke University. She's a specialist in biblical studies and archaeology, a prominent scholar in the study of women in the biblical world. Okay, that's who she is, that's her credentials. Let me read to you from page 193 what she has to say about patriarchy first, then we're going to get into heterarchy, okay? In page 193, she says, she talks, and there's a chapter heading here, the patriarchy problem. She said, defining patriarchy is not easy, As a theory meant to account for widespread gender stratification in human societies, it is often understood to be a general system in which power is held by adult men. It usually implies near total male domination at the micro level of personal relationship, as well as in macro institutional forms. So the idea here is that in a patriarchal system, the idea is that at every level, at the bigger level in terms of, let's say, institutions, religious institution, the military, men are in charge, but even at the family level, in smaller ways, men are in charge. They're the ones who hold the power. And she says it's not easy to define it. She goes on to say, this is on page 194. She says, the term patriarchy comes from the Greek word pater, father, and archein, to rule. It is used to denote a hierarchical social system. Its use to denote a hierarchical social system became common in the writings of 19th century European social scientists. She goes on to say that the legal authority, the patria potestas, of the male head of the ancient household, he was called the pater familias. We're going to be talking, well, I've talked about this before. We're going to be talking about this again when we get to the New Testament. He says the legal authority of the male head of the ancient household was generalized to represent pervasive male control throughout society. So they looked at the Greco-Roman model and they utilized that to generalize and to represent male control throughout other societies. Patriarchy was considered a system that systematically and structurally oppresses women and gives men authority over political, social, and economic institution. And then she says, I would add religious institutions to this list. Now, let me say this. Technically, in many ways, with one exception, which I'll explain in a moment, this is the complementarian view. This is how Piper sees the complementarian view and how men, how he defines what it is to be a man or what it is to be masculine. She says, patriarchy was considered a system that systematically and structurally oppresses women and gives men authority over political, social, and economic institutions. I would add religious institutions to this list. Now, the one area that I would say that Piper would omit and remove is the idea of complementarianism being structurally and systematically and structurally oppressive to women. He would say, no, we're not oppressive to women, but I think he would agree that it is that authority is given to men over, and that because what we read before, men are to lead in the political, social, and economic, and even religious, the church for us today, institutions. So he would not agree that complementarian is to oppress women. He speaks against that. So I want to be careful. He would speak against that. But in terms of men having the authority in all of these other areas, political, social, economic, and even religious, he would say, yes, men are to lead. Whether it's your wife or not, generally speaking, men are always to be in the lead in all of these areas. He does recognize, as we read, there can be problems in today's society when you have women in charge over men. But as a rule, he holds to, basically, I think I can safely say, the ideal is that men would lead in all of these things. And I know that there are men who literally think this way because I've listened to some of their sermons. Okay, so this is, again, Dr. Mayers, she is defining what patriarchy is. Let's see if there's anything else I want to read to you here. Yeah. Okay. So she talks about what patriarchy is. She says patriarchy, the term, entered biblical studies in the 1800s when two renowned biblical scholars, William Robertson Smith and Julius Wellhausen, asserted that ancient Israelite society was dominated by the universal form of the patriarchal family as it evolved from tribe to state. Okay, so we know where did this come from of calling ancient Near Eastern societies, ancient Israel patriarchal model, that the ancient Israelite society was a patriarchal model. It came from William Robertson Smith and Julius Wellhausen in the 1800s. She goes on to say, although the term continues to be used, patriarchy is an inadequate and inappropriate designation and can no longer be seen as a cultural universal. And then she begins to give some reasons why this is so. So let me go back for a moment and just say, so we know what the term means. It has to do with the idea of men being in control of political, social, and economic institutions, even religious institutions, even at both a macro level and a micro level, and also that it entered into biblical studies in the 1800s. She says, Dr. Mayer, is that this term, even though it's still being used, at the time this book was written, it was still being used, and it's still being used today. I think this is a 2000, let me hang on for a second. This is a 2000, this is a 2013, this is the 2013 edition of the book. The book was written earlier. Originally it was called Discovering Eve, then she redid it, added some information, now it's called Rediscovering Eve. Okay, she said, although this term continues to be used, patriarchy is an inadequate and inappropriate designation and can no longer be seen as a cultural universal. Among the reasons for this assessment are the following. Now she gives 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. She gives about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. She gives 8 reasons why it can no longer be used. I'm not going to read all the reasons. I'm going to read you at least 3. 3. She says, classicist, this is one of the reasons she believes it should not be used. Classicist questions the validity of the model from ancient Rome that gave rise to modern notions of patriarchy in the first place. In other words, people who study the Roman world in the classical period, she's saying these experts in this field, they question the validity of the model, of the patriarchal model. Then she goes on to say, ethnographic reports from the Mediterranean world, like those cited in this chapter, she does talk about this. So ethnographic reports about how cultures function, how they operate, what their culture is like. She said these reports from the Mediterranean world and from other traditional societies indicate that much household power resides with senior women. Now, we've talked about this before. I'm not going to go back and read it, but I've talked about this, and we quoted from this book, The Social Role of Ancient Israel, where Dr. Victor Matthews and Don Benjamin also talks about this, that the women held much authority and power, and they even quote some of the work of Dr. Mayers. Okay, so ethnographic reports from the Mediterranean world and from other traditional societies indicate that much household power resides with senior women. Now stay with me, I know this is a lot. Last 2 things to read. Using the patriarchal paradigm implies a fixed set of relationships when in fact social arrangements are rarely static and power relationships can shift over time. So this is her other reasons for saying you can't use a patriarchal model, because the patriarchy paradigm implies a fixed set of relationships when in fact social arrangements are rarely static and power relations can shift over time. She goes on to say the focus on the subordination of women overlooks the fact that inequalities are a function of class or age as much as if not more than of gender. Let me read that one more time, it's a lot. The focus on the subordination of women overlooks the fact that inequalities are a function of class or age as much as, if not more than, of gender. So she says, focusing on the subordination of women, as they do within the patriarchal model, overlooks that there are other inequalities that happen, not because of gender, but because of class, because of age. These are things that also contribute to subordination and inequality. She says, for example, insufficient regard is given to the inferior position of servants, slaves, and strangers, or aliens, probably people of different ethnicity in ancient Israel. And male heredity institutions, like the Israelite priesthood, are a little noticed form of exclusion that excludes most men as well as women from arenas of community religious power. We are going to talk about that next week. Why were women excluded from the priesthood? I'm going to give some possible reasons why. But she says that the exclusion from the priesthood applied not only to women, but it also applied to men. So it's not just about gender. Okay, so she said there are other areas where all of this takes place. All right, she says patriarchy is a hierarchical model that cannot be uniformly applied to ancient complex societies. So the work of Dr. Mayers here in this book, this is a phenomenal book for those of you that are nerdy like me. Great book to read if you want to get more into depth and detail. I've gone to this book gone back to it over and over again, and it's been very insightful to me to help me to understand ancient Israelite culture. I'm not saying that everything she says is 100%, but a lot of great insight in here. And things change as we keep studying and stuff. But the one thing she says is that we really can't look upon ancient Israelite culture as a patriarchal culture. Now, it is a male-dominated culture. There is hierarchy in the culture, but she said we can't think of it as a patriarchal culture. Let me go back to one thing she said. She said that's because a patriarchal paradigm implies a fixed set of relationships when in fact social arrangements are rarely static and power relations can shift over time. In other words, there can occur changes in who's in charge. She said, but a patriarchal paradigm, and I'm going to add the word complementarian model, will not allow for that. But she said a patriarchal model also doesn't allow for that. And so she recognized that where that's concerned. So let me read to you something else she said. Everybody with me so far? Stay with me. Okay, so this is page 197. She says, and she talks about hierarchy. Now we're going to get into hierarchy, the hierarchical model. A patriarchal model does not explain why we see women in positions of leadership, because a patriarchal model doesn't allow for shifting of relationships. It doesn't allow for shifts of power, where one person can be in charge in one moment, but then it might shift that another person is charged. She said a patriarchal model doesn't allow for that. It's too rigid. She goes on and it begins to explain on page 196 the hierarchy alternative. She says, as anthropologists define it, hierarchy, and we're going to talk about hierarchy for a second. Hierarchy designates an organizational structure in which, on the basis of certain factors, some elements are subordinate to others and are usually ranked according. So within a hierarchy, there are certain elements, there are certain criteria that determines that some people will be in charge and other people will be submitted and subordinate to their authority and to their leadership. In the complementarian model, what are the factors? It's the gender of the woman. The fact that you're a woman is the factor that puts you in subordination to men. So gender in the complementarian model is a hierarchical model. It puts women in subjection to men because of gender. That's the factor. She goes on to say, recognizing that not all social systems are organized hierarchically, some of the social scientists who challenge the evolutionary models underlying the concept of hierarchical systems offer a more nuanced and adaptable model, and this model is called heterarchy. Now we're going to talk about heterarchy. This is hardly a household term, she says. It's a combination of two Greek words, heteros, which means different or other, and archon, which means to rule. Heterarchy was introduced in the 1940s to describe neural structures which aren't always arranged hierarchically. More simply, it is a term that can account for the fact that past societies had multiple sources of power that did not necessarily line up in a single set of vertical hierarchical relationships. So she said, when you look at societies, when we looked at the different relationships, it always did not work according to a hierarchical structure where, because of certain factors, some people are going to be at the top and some people are going to be in charge, and certain people will have to follow those who are in charge. She said that didn't always line up. She said, with respect to gender, heterarchy can accommodate arenas of activity in which women have power and agency. It can also incorporate the intersection of gender with other variables like age and class. So she's saying here again, with heterarchy can accommodate or explain areas of activity where women have power and agency. Okay? She said the heterarchy model takes into account many of the flaws noted above in the hierarchical or patriarchal model. For example, it does not assume that ranking is permanent or that the ranking of elements according to different criteria will always succeed. So the hierarchy model does not assume that if you have a certain ranking or position, you will always be permanently in that ranking and position. Now, what is the complementarian model again? The complementarian model is if you are a man, you are always to lead. You are always to be in the superordinate position, and women, you are to follow that lead, support that lead of the man, and encourage it. You are always to be in the subordinate position. What Dr. Maris here is saying, the hierarchy model does not follow the hierarchical model. The hierarchical model does not assume that the positions will always be permanent. Okay? She says, not surprisingly, hierarchy has been interpreted and employed in many different ways. One of the most promising for this project is the integration of hierarchy in gender. She goes on to say, hierarchy provides a compelling concept for representing ancient Israelite society in the Iron Age. Perhaps its most attractive feature is that I didn't want to read that yet. I'm going to come back to that. Let me stop right there. Let's see. I don't want to read that yet. I'm going to come back to it. Let's see. Oh, this is what I want to read. She said, in the hierarchical model, this interweaving of differently structured patterns of relationship means that an individual, an Israelite woman in an agrarian household, for example, can rank high in one modality, but low in another. So she's saying here that within the ancient Israelite society that we've been studying and reading about, a woman can be low in one area, but rank high in another. She can be subordinate to one, but in charge in another, okay? The maintenance activities and social structures of ancient Israel meant that daily life was rarely structured according to fixed hierarchical gender patterns. Let me read that again. The maintenance activities and social structures of ancient Israel meant that daily life was rarely structured according to fixed hierarchical gender patterns, meaning you don't have the complementarian model as I'm applying it, that the lifestyle of the ancient Israelite was not based upon the men must always be in leadership and the women must always be subordinate to that leadership, submitted to that leadership, and following that leadership, and the women are never to lead the men. That was not the way life was lived. She said a woman's position would vary over time according to other factors such as age, participation in community activities, and role in the informal network of women formed by her work patterns. And certain systems associated with women holding extra household professional positions, let me stop there. Certain systems associated with women holding extra household professional positions would have their own hierarchies and cultural authority vis-a-vis other systems. When she talks about other systems with women holding extra household professional positions, went back and read it in chapter 9, she talks about this. That is talking about women like Deborah, the Shunammite woman, the wise woman of Abel Beth Ma'achah. They are holding extra household positions. So she is saying the hierarchy model applies not only to the Israelite household, it also applies to these women who are outside of the household, quote unquote, meaning that they're functioning outside of just simply being wives and mothers. They can hold positions of authority outside of the home, okay? She says all of these factors contest the existence of Israelite patriarchy, which assigns general subordination to women. Let me read that again for the people in the back. All of these factors that we've just talked about contest, they challenge the existence of Israelite patriarchy, which assigns general subordination to women. In other words, if I'm just going to put it within the context of what we're talking today, she said all of these factors contest this model of men are always supposed to be in the lead, and women are to be submitted to that lead and always follow that lead. She says all of these factors contest that. In other words, as I said before, how is it that we see that women are acting in positions of authority if the God-designed norm is that women are never to lead, men are always supposed to be in lead? And she said it can be explained by the hierarchical model, not the patriarchal model. And so she says, when we look at ancient Israel, what we are seeing, when we see women in the home, as we have looked at, and women outside of the home, operating in authority, operating in leadership, operating autonomously, operating with authority. She said, when we're seeing that, what we're seeing is not a patriarchal model, because a patriarchal model, you wouldn't see that, because the positions would be fixed and there is no shifting of position or power. But you do see it with a heterarchal model. So what she is proposing and putting forth, and I believe she is correct, is that what we see in the ancient Israel lifestyle, what we see in these women, when I asked the question, how do we explain these women being in positions of authority and power in male-dominated culture? The answer is they're operating not by a patriarchal model, they're operating by a heterarchal model, which allows for changes and shifts in authority. Now, so in this model, gender, in the heterarchal model, gender is not the criteria or the determining factor for leadership. In the heterarchal model, gender is not the criteria or the determining factor for leadership. Leadership can be based upon age, knowledge, skill, gifting, and in regards to God's people, it would also be based upon his sovereign call in relationship to the situation and the circumstances at hand. Do you hear that? Do you get that? I know I read a lot, and I know that was a lot. You may have to go back and listen to it again, but I'm putting it in a nutshell here. What she's basically saying that in a heterarchal model, gender is not the defining or determining factor for leadership. The fact that you are a man does not automatically make you the leader. The fact that you are a woman does not automatically exclude you from leadership within the home, within society, even where other men are concerned. It can be based upon, within a heterarchal model, leadership, especially where women are concerned, can be based upon age, knowledge, skill, gifting. And as I would add, she didn't say this, but I said it, in regards to God's people, it would also be based upon his sovereign call in relationship to the situation and circumstance at hand. So like Deborah, she was sovereignly called by God to be not only a prophet, but also a judge. She was called of God to do that, okay? And other women. Jael was called of God to bring defeat to Sisera. That was a woman defeating a man. She was, as Dr. Michelle Knight said, a non-combatant, yet God used her to help in the war, okay? This is, and usually it is a man who does that, right? Men are usually the leaders, the protectors, the providers. But in the story of Deborah, chapter 4 and 5, we see women. Barak is there, yes, but we also see women taking center stage also. So hierarchies still existed, but how men and women function in those hierarchies in relations to each other. In other words, who leads, who's followed, who's the boss, how they function in relationship to each other could change based upon who was best suited for the task at hand. And this would again include the call of God. It would be based upon the situation, the circumstances, who is best suited for the task at hand, okay? Let me give you a modern day example of this, of heterarchy and how it works and how you can have shifting relationships of influence and power that's not based upon gender or ranking, that the rankings could shift and change based upon a heterarchal model, not a patriarchal model. All right, let me read to you from this book. This is a modern day example. Let me take a sip of water. And I hope this is clear. I know I read a lot. I know I took a chance in reading all that it could kind of get a little bit complex, but it's good for that. It stretches your brain and makes you think, okay? But I hope with my explanation, it makes it clearer. So in a heterarchal model, rankings, positions of power and influence and authority, they are not fixed, they are not rigid, they can change. And Dr. Mayers is saying, in everything I read, in a nutshell, she's saying, this is what we see in Israel. This is why you see a Deborah in leadership in a male-dominated society. This is why you see Abigail taking authority, even though her husband said, we're not giving David and his men anything. This is why we see Miriam in a position of leadership in a male-dominated culture. This is why you see these women in positions of authority, not because they are following, talking about the culture is not following a patriarchal model, it's following a heterarchal model, right? Now, let me give you a modern example of that from this book called Switchcraft. Switch, not witch, Switchcraft. This is the hidden power of mental agility. This is a book I'm currently reading. It's about It says, discover the science behind mental flexibility and how improving your ability to change your thoughts, feelings, and actions can end negative thought loops, boost your emotional resilience, and transform your life. This is a field in which I work and coach people in and train people in, so it's one of the reasons I'm reading the book. This is from chapter 1 of the book, and the author of the book is Dr. Elaine Fox, and she gives this example of these people who are in a war, okay? And this is a modern day example, real life example, and how they deal with having to deal with those who have been wounded in battle, and how they attend to those who are wounded in battle on the battlefield, how the doctors and those involved, how do they actually treat them, and how they work together to treat those wounded in battle while on the battlefield. So let me read to you. It's going to be a little bit in-depth reading here. She says, usually it is pitch black and deafening. The thump, thump, thump of rotor blades in the night air drowns out the sporadic swoosh of passing missiles. Lurching from side to side, it is impossible for the women and men crammed into the tiny space in the back to know how far the helicopter is from the ground, or even how far they are from their destination. 2 minutes, comes the call. Every member of the team then becomes absorbed in a private world of checking and double checking. Backpack secured, check. Headlight in place and turned off, check. Jacket closed, check. Helmet secured, check. As the helicopter arcs towards the ground, a side door opens. The command to go, go, go marks the exit of each team member as they are dropped at speed, one by one, from 4 feet above the ground. Seconds later, the helicopter peels away so as not to alert anyone to their position, and the team is running through the darkness to find the injured. It is the heat that first hits you and the stench, and the smell of burning flesh is something you never forget. Colonel Pete Mahoney commands the British Army's Medical Emergency Response Team, or MERT. They work in small teams under the most difficult of conditions, operating much of the time in a dark helicopter. They have to keep their lights switched off so as not to attract enemy fire. Dropped into battlefields at great pace to treat the injured, they frequently come under intense gunfire as they make their way to the casualties. These teams typically comprise 5 to 6 people, including trauma surgeons, anesthesists, nurses, and paramedics, and at least 2 regular soldiers whose job it is to protect the medical team. Colonel Pete, a medical consultant, is often the most senior officer in the team and in overall charge. But a different group member, now this is where we see the hierarchical model comes into play. Colonel Pete is the medical consultant. He's the most senior officer in the team, and overall he's in charge. But a different group member will take control of the team at different points in the mission, depending on the nature of the situation. When they are first dropped on the ground, it is the soldiers who take the lead. Once the squad finds any casualties, one of the medical staff will then take over command and begin a systematic assessment of the nature of the injuries. However, at any time, the security detail can reassert a command and order the team out of the area if it's judged to be too dangerous. Once an indication of priority of the casualties is given, the anesthesiologist then takes control. The anesthesiologist then takes control and decides who can be sedated and brought back to the helicopter and who needs to be treated in situ, meaning they're in that situation. All of this occurs on a live battlefield, often under heavy fire. These are rapidly moving situations that can change in seconds. Less critically ill patients are allocated for treatment in a specific order, usually on the spot, and one of the nursing staff will typically take responsibility for this. The decision of how and when to bring the injured back to the relative safety of the helicopter is made by the soldiers, not by the colonel, by the soldiers. And command at that point is taken over by the helicopter pilot, who decides if it's safe to return and land in the location indicated by the staff on the ground. Then, when they arrive back on the helicopter, bringing with them the most seriously injured victims, a decision often has to be made about whether to operate straight away in the lurching, almost dark of the aircraft, or to wait until they get back to the field hospital. This is taken by Colonel Pete in consultation with another senior medical officer. Okay, do you get the point here of what I'm talking about? This is a great description of what Dr. Mayers is talking about in terms of the hierarchical model. If you see in this situation here, they're on a battlefield, you do have ranking. There is a hierarchy, but it shifts constantly in terms of who's in charge based upon the situation. So when they're going to treat the injured, the doctors and the nurses might be in charge. But if the soldiers who are guiding them and making sure they stayed safe decide this is unsafe, they issue a command and all of a sudden they're in charge and their orders have to be followed, even though the senior officer is Colonel Pete. So you could have a private, but if he goes, we have to go now, they have to follow his orders. It changes based upon the giftings, based upon the situation. If they go back to the helicopter and the helicopter pilot says, we can't carry them, they have to leave them. The helicopter pilot is the one now who's in charge. This is the hierarchical model. It changes based upon gifting, knowledge, skill, and the situation at hand. And this is what Dr. Mayers, if I'm reading her correctly, and I believe I am, this is what she says, what we see in Israel. We see here in the book Switchcraft, a hierarchical model at work. But again, the hierarchical model that we see at work here, like I said before, is what Dr. Mayer says we see at work in ancient Israel. This explains why we see women, even in a male-dominated culture, leading. This is why we see them leading. Even though it's a male-dominated culture, not a patriarchal culture, but a male-dominated culture with hierarchy. Even though there is hierarchy, like Dr. Mayer said, with a hierarchical model, the ranks are more flexible and fluid, and they may change at any moment, depending on the circumstances, depending on the knowledge, the skill, the age of the people that are involved. And so this is why a Deborah, rather than a Barak, becomes the leader. Barak is a leader, but Deborah is also a leader who directs him as to where he is to go as a prophet. She is a leader as a judge. Okay, evidently she had the knowledge and the skills necessary to order to judge the people of Israel. This is why the wise woman of Abel Beth Ma'achah, she is the one who approaches the city wall to talk to Joab, not another man of the city. It's because of the hierarchical model. The hierarchical model allows for female leadership even where men are concerned. And again, it allows for hierarchies to exist. While it does allow for hierarchies to exist, it also challenges and repudiates the patriarchal or complementary idea of men must always be in the lead over women. It challenges, and I believe it repudiates, the hierarchical model challenges and repudiates the complementarian relationship model that men must always be in the lead over women. It doesn't do away with male leadership, but it renders unnecessary the need to downplay, dilute, and deny female leadership over men, or even apart from men, that we see in the scripture. So the hierarchical leadership does not say there are no male leads, there's only women out. No, it doesn't say that. It still affirms male leadership. And it shows that there are times when male leadership will be needed. And again, it also shows that, yes, this is a male-dominated culture. You do have male leadership, but it also shows there can be female leadership. So therefore, it is unnecessary to downplay, to dilute, and deny female leadership. That happens if you're using a patriarchal model, but it's not necessary if you're using a hierarchical model. Now, let me read to you what I started to read to you early, one more time from Dr. Mayer's book. This is page 199. And she says this. She says, yet the hierarchical model does not mean that no hierarchies exist. Women's household power was significant given the centrality of the household in the lives of most Israelites. And women held some extra household professional positions, prophets, wise women, judges. But these features do not mean general gender equality or the absence of male privilege. Male dynasties and priesthoods and their bureaucracies were the norm, excluding women and also most men. The male military brought men into positions of community power. immovable property or land was owned mainly, not always, but mainly by men. So she says, yes, it is a male-dominated society. A hierarchical model does not remove that. So the hierarchies can still be there, but it's not patriarchy where it's fixed and women are not able to move into positions of power like we see in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew scriptures. If you utilize a patriarchal model, then they can't move. But if a hierarchical model allows them to move in different positions of leadership. But what she acknowledges is it's still a male-dominated society, which means that even with the hierarchical model, it's not the ideal model. It's not God's original intent. It's better than a patriarchal model, but it is still not God's ideal model. It's not, even with a hierarchical model in society, it's still not egalitarian. There's still not equality. So it's not ideal, though it is better than the patriarchal because it allows women to move into positions of leadership. Okay. Now we're going to talk some more next week about, well, we're going to talk some more about this next week. So let me go on and finish here. So again, the hierarchical model does not deny hierarchy, but it does challenge and repudiate again the complementarian model of men are to always and only lead, women are to only submit to, follow, and nurture male lead, and never lead a man. The hierarchical model challenges that, and I believe repudiates that. The hierarchical model shows that a woman's leadership was not limited to only other women or children, but could include men as well, as we see in the biblical studies that we studied over the past few weeks. This is why I say the complementarian foundation for the subordination of women needs to be rethought. It is based upon a patriarchal model. And as we said here, and we read here, that's not a good model. It needs to be rethought because the patriarchal model upon which the complementarian model is based, men always lead or is always in the lead over women. Women, because of their gender, are excluded from leadership over men. This does not fit the biblical and cultural data. The patriarchal complementarian model does not fit the biblical and cultural data. It cannot be sustained. And this is why I say we must rethink, or when I mean we rethink, I think even complementarians, primarily I mean complementarians, they need to rethink the complementarian model. Because when you do the research and you look at the Bible, yes, but you look at also the cultural data, the ethnographic data, it doesn't fit. The patriarchal model doesn't fit the data. And now, if somebody might say, oh, you're going against the Bible. No, I'm going against if you're a complementarian, I'm going against your interpretation of the text. Not against the Bible, against your interpretation of the Bible, your interpretation, your model that you bring. And what I'm saying is, based upon what we see in the biblical text, based upon what we see in the ethnographic archaeological data, that model, the patriarchal complementarian model, cannot be sustained. I'm going to end that right here. Whew, I knew this was going to take a little bit to get through, but we got through it. All right, so we're finished with this part now. Next week, we're going to be talking about why were women excluded from the Israelite priesthood, and is this proof that God intends men and not women to be the primary leaders because women were not allowed to be part of the priesthood? We are going to talk about that, Lord willing, next week. So if you enjoyed this, please do a couple of things. Number one, tell your friends about it. Have them watch this. We have a website called KIC TV. It's not a website, it's a YouTube channel, KIC TV, Keep It In Context TV with Mike Davis. You can go there, they can go there, you can direct them there to watch the video. I'll have it uploaded within the next 2 hours. All of our other videos can also be found there on this series. If you're watching the series on the YouTube channel, KIC TV, please hit the like button and hit the subscribe button. That helps the algorithm, helps our message to go out to more people. Our goal here is to speak the truth of the Bible, to teach the Bible in its original cultural, historical, linguistic, and literary context. My belief is if we better understand what God has said, then we better understand what God is saying. All right. Hope you enjoyed this. Hope you learned a lot. If you need to go back through it and watch it again, please do so. Until then, we will see you next week. God bless. Thank you for joining us today.